I'll talk to you guys a little
I
bit
don't know,
about,
is it mine?
probably the best walleye tactic, at least in my arsenal for fishing here, pretty much throughout the fall and winter. And that would be casting jigs, namely, but particularly casting plastics. As the water cools down, starts hitting that 55-degree and colder, this is probably the one thing that I turn to day in, day out to catch big fish here, namely because one, where they live. A lot of these big fish here come out of inches of water sometimes, and casting jigs to them is a pretty effective way to get them. This is not necessarily a new art by any means. It's been around for quite a while. Some of the pioneers of the legends, the River Rat Randys, and these guys have been doing this for decades. And the rest of us have just kind of caught on to it in the last 10 years. I think it's probably boomed the most. I use about a 6'8" or 7-foot rod when I do it. I'm kind of an old school guy. I still use monofilament line. I use a high vis for the sole purpose of, I can tell a lot better with monofilament line when it hits the bottom. And one of the keys to this, depending on if you're pitching, especially riprap, I need to know as soon as that jig hits the bottom so I can pick it right back up. Because I always say when you're doing this, there's a pretty fine line between being snagged or getting bit, because you really got to tickle that fringe. So with monofilament line versus the super lines, I can tell immediately when that jig hits the bottom because the line will drop. And you can see it, it's a pretty pronounced drop, and you'll see a little squiggle come in the line. And as soon as I see that, I'm going to pick it right back up. Because what I'm doing, I'm going to throw in, and it's falling, and then, well, when we would normally have more current, it's going to fall and sweep at the same time. So I want to know immediately when that jig contacts the bottom so I can pick it right back up. So I've stuck to the old school monofilament line. This is a Stren Gold. Berkeley Sensation makes a good one. The downfall to use a monofilament line versus a fire line, it just plain simply doesn't hold up like a fire line will. I'm changing line almost daily when I'm doing this because it gets twisty on you, and in the cold weather, the colder it gets, you start snagging up, busting off, it gets pretty brittle on you. So I change it quite frequently. There are guys that throw fire line and have great success doing it, and now this year I see they've got a nice bright orange fire line that they came out with. That'll definitely help the cause, and I'll probably play around with that a little more this winter. So generally, a 7-foot rod, monofilament line, spin cast. I use an extra fast tip rod because I'm going to set the hook the minute I see anything happen to that jig, and I'm going to set it hard. And all I want to do is drill that fish and roll it and get it out away from the bank or whatever I'm throwing. So I use a fast tip because a lot of times when you get bit, you'll feel or see a flick in the line, and if you're not on it just like that, they're gone. Very rarely will they hang on to it for any amount of time, so I want to drill them as soon as I can, and I want to know I've got a backbone to do it. When I first started doing it, at the time I was with the All-Star Rod Company, and I was actually using their bass rods to do it, which were like pool cues. I mean, literally, they were just very, very stiff, and that's what I started doing it with. And when I graduated out of those and moved over to the Croys and whatever else rods, I actually struggled for a while because I didn't feel like I could set the hook hard enough, even with these fast tips. So, moral of the story, I don't know if you can have too stiff a rod for doing this. Ringworms is probably my #1 search bait when it comes to fishing plastics. Day in, day out, purple with a chartreuse tail, purple with a white tail, chartreuse pepper, cotton candy. I'm trying to think of all the names. I mean, they all have their day. There's probably 6 colors that I would religiously keep in the boat. Pro Blue is obviously one, and oyster shell. Those are probably the best ones. One thing, when you're pitching jigs, because it's such a fine line between like snagged and bit here on the river, the weight of the jig is absolutely crucial, and it's constantly changing depending on the amount of current you're going to fish, the depth of water you're throwing to, and the size of plastic will make all that difference too. The odd size jigs that hardly anybody carries, can get them here. Obviously, Dean has some. Bee Fishing makes them. It's the 16th ounce sizes that are very, very hard to find. Most companies make a 1/4 ounce, 1/8 ounce, 3/8, and a half. They skip those in between sizes, so they're pretty hard to find. The other thing with a good plastic jig is the oversized hook. Have a bigger hook on it. And these particular ones have a keeper on them also to push the plastic onto. So any jig head will work to a point, but I like the oversized, and I definitely, if I had to keep one jig in my box for doing this, and I could only have one, it'd be a 3/16 ounce. If I had to pick one, that's the size I would choose, because I feel that's the one I can fish the most effectively. When I'm talking about the size of plastics making a difference, if you look at the profile of a ringworm versus say a K-grub or a moxie, they grab more water, plain and simple, as they fall. So obviously, the bigger the plastic, you may have to upsize your jig. A lot of times with the ringworms, what I'll do, I tear 1 inch off the end, right off the head, before I thread them on. Makes them a little lighter, seems to help reduce my short strikes when I'm doing it, and they seem to be able to suck it in a little faster. I suppose we could stand here and debate for about 2 hours whether you go tail up or tail down. I don't care. Just put it on there, tail up or tail down, whatever your confidence is. I think one thing tournament fishing and traveling all over the place has taught me, fishing is absolutely more to me about confidence than anything. And that's really hard for some people to gain in pitching plastics. They'll go out and try it for a little bit, don't have any success maybe immediately, and they have a tendency to give up on it and think, you gotta have a minnow or whatever. Cold water. The colder the water, the less minnows I use. I'll literally go from probably November on without hardly ever putting bait in my boat. I just exclusively throw plastics most of the time, and I'll just play around with the different profiles, and that's what I do. One thing about it that you got to kind of keep in mind is most of the time you're not going to sit and pluck fish after fish after fish off one spot. It's kind of like fishing smallmouth bass. You know, it's 1 or 2 fish here, 1 or 2 fish there, move on, maybe come back in a little bit and hit it later. There's not very often, you know, there's a few spots up here where I feel like I can anchor up and sit there and catch good numbers of fish. But most of the time for me it's a run and gun deal. You know, I'm chasing riprap, different riprap, wing dams, sandbars, and I go from spot to spot to spot and try and pick 1 or 2, 3 fish off there, and then it's typically over. Fishing has a lot of theories, and one of my theories on that is most of these fish you're catching are pretty shallow. Most of the time, a lot of times, you know, they're under 3 feet of water, and I think what it is you throw in there, you stick that fish, they go this way a lot of times, you know, they go left, right, and then they swim out away from the bank, and I think they get in there and they spook the fish out, you know, especially after you get a couple of them out of there. So come back, if it dries up on you, don't be afraid to come back in a half hour, 45 minutes, let those fish set up again in that spot, and then hit them again. The other trick that to try before you leave, change your plastic. Either change a color or change a profile. Preferably probably downsize it. You know, if you're throwing a ringworm, try a little paddle tail or a little twister tail or something. Try to downsize it, and every once in a while you can pick an extra fish or 2 off that way. The spots. Well, let me back up a second here. One of the things that I can tell you, if you're new to this and you're trying to learn it, every variable comes into play, whether it's wind, current, water depth, boat control. It's all going to change your jig, and you have to be able to react with the jig weight to fix that. Okay? the best advice I can give you, if this is something you're trying to learn new or you don't feel you're very good at it, anchor up. Take that variable out of it. Whatever you're going to fish, throw the anchor so the boat sits more stationary. Until you get more accustomed with reading that bait, what it's doing, that jig as it's flowing on the bottom, and you can tell immediately when it picks up and hits the bottom so you can pick it right back up. Because if I'm slipping down the current, a lot of times I can use a lighter jig because I'm actually going with the water, okay? But at the same time, I'm throwing another variable in there because now the boat's moving also. So if you anchor up until you get some confidence in doing this, it will help you, you know, gain. You can figure out a lot better what that jig's doing and swimming, and you'll learn to read that line a lot better if you take that variable out. Wind is tough to pitch jigs in, there's no doubt. It takes another aspect out of it. Not much you can do about it other than to seek another spot. The biggest trick is to upsize the jig generally when you get into the wind, because the wind's going to grab that line, put a bow on it, and guess what? It's lifting that jig up off the bottom. And you almost always want to be right next to the bottom, that fine line of snag or bit. So play with your jig size. Make sure you have, you know, 3 or 4 different ones if you need to. If you have to pick one and you're only going to pick one, start with a 3/16 or a quarter. You're better off to go heavy at first, so you can see the jig hit the bottom and learn to read that. What you need, bud? Oh. Locations. The easiest, again, to start out, if this is something you're just learning, start on the sand. It'll be a lot more friendly to you because you start on the riprap. On average time out, if I'm pitching riprap, I'm going to tie probably 15, 20 jigs. That's just the nature of the beast. And if it's something you don't have a lot of confidence, you're probably going to get frustrated before you actually start getting good at it and catch fish. So start on the sand, you know, get yourself up here between the wing dams, anchor in the current seams or off the current seams, and work those current seams on the sand. It'll be a lot more forgiving to you than riprap until you learn to catch some fish. The other thing, get accustomed to it, go fish striped bass. Anything will eat these things. I mean, you catch a hodgepodge of fish every time you go do it generally. But we got plentiful white bass out here. I feel like I'm doing bus training. This is what I fought the other day doing bus training.
Get out of the way!
And to think I plugged your company.
What's your definition of riprap?
Riprap?
Yeah.
Rock. Rock structure. You know, like even this point straight directly below here, the riprap along the lock wall would be what I would classify as riprap. Anything rock, you know. Wing dam, not really riprap, it's designed different, but any rocky shore I would consider to be riprap. The sand, like I said, will be a lot more forgiving to you.
Come on! Get away! No respect for the seminar. And he's in a warrior beside.
Pull him over. That's the one with no brake light.
Anyways, if it's something you're just starting to pick up, try the sand first. Try working some sand. It'll be a lot more forgiving to you. You won't get frustrated tying jigs so much. You know, catch a few fish, get some confidence, then go start trying to work some riprap, different areas. Because there you definitely got to be able to read that line and know when that jig hits, because if you don't, you're going to be tying and you'll be tying and you'll be tying. This is probably one of the hardest techniques that I have had to teach people, is doing this. It gets very frustrating to them. Once you get it and you start catching fish, it's amazing. If I could do this every day that I'm on the water, this is what I would do. It's just what I absolutely love to do. I should be a bass fisherman, I guess, is what I'm trying to tell myself, but I'm not that smart. Riprap, try to pick areas. I guess the best example I can give you right now is if you're familiar with the lock wall up here, the rocks. You've got the current coming down, sweeping out of the Y. and it'll come in and it'll hit that bank. You know, it'll come in, it'll contact that riprap. Those areas there where the current is actually doing something different and or changing speeds is a very, very likely place to look. And throw it right in tight and just work that jig down the bank and let it fall and sweep. If it's not sweeping, again, we don't have much current this year, so it's going to be a little different game, but if it's not sweeping at the same time, probably look at one of two things. You're not maybe in an area where there's enough current to do it, and maybe you should look somewhere else, or you're too heavy. Because you want to fall and sweep down that bank is what I'm looking for. When a fish hits it, generally, as long as it's not windy and you've got everything right, you got your weight right and all that, you'll know. It's just, sometimes it's a quick thump, a little flick in the line that you'll either feel or see. The next time it might take the rod right out of your hand, literally.
So always use Pitts' rods.
Always what?
Use Pitts' rods.
Yeah, how'd that go, Lucas?
That's another seminar.
That's alright. Quick story, my son was fishing with Ryan today out of Jason's boat, and they were, I don't know what they dragging jigs, I'm guessing, and all of a sudden one of Jason's rods got donated to fish gods. Gracefully by my son. But yeah,
It wasn't a big deal, it was a rhino rod.
probably a pink one, I'm guessing.
Had my favorite Zelco 33 on it though.
But working the rock, catch a lot of fish off the rock, you're gonna snag a lot, you're gonna bust off, it's just the nature of the beast. I don't know, Randy, how many jigs you go through when you go pitching for a day?
Depends on the rock.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and it depends on your skill level. The more skill level you get, the better you'll be at it and you'll lose less. But it's just one of them deals, you're gonna have to be willing to donate a bit to reap the rewards
So
of
if
it.
you pitch with dragon jigs that aren't so susceptible.
I have not really done the dragon jigs, to be real honest with you. I don't know why they wouldn't work, I guess.
I hardly ever pitched with them. I had a guide trip yesterday, and I had people that I knew weren't going to know how to pitch, but I was thinking that's what we had to do to catch fish. So I set them up with 8-ounce dragon jigs and plastics, and it worked great.
Sure.
They caught fish.
I mean, would you agree this is probably one of the hardest techniques to teach somebody?
Oh, beyond a doubt.
I mean,
Yeah.
I've told Dustin Stewart, if I've told him once, I've told him 2 dozen times, I don't know how you do it. I mean, he religiously teaches people pitching, and it's like, I know they're watching you catch fish, don't they get sick of it, you know? I take people out and might catch 10 fish, and they might catch one, they might not catch any until they get it. But then once they get it, they get the confidence in it, then they can start to roll with you, okay? So, again, to start out, if it's something you're new to, don't be afraid to anchor up. I mean, we've got great advances in boats now with these spot locks and stuff on these Tarovas, but they're far from perfect. You know, if you're good at it and you're used to it and you can adjust for that boat movement with your rod, because you can do that, you know, if all of a sudden you're sweeping too fast, you can lower your rod tip and control that jig a little better. If you get to that point, yeah. I mean, I hop around on my spot lock all the time. But it is far easier just to throw the anchor and stay stationary and take that variable out of it.
Quick drink here. That might require 2 anchors. If you got wind
Yep.
sweeping in
Yep.
the current like this, you're still moving.
Right. And generally when you anchor up, you're going to probably fish either off the side of the boat or off the back. You know, and you can do the same. You get on a current seam, you can pitch out the back of the boat and work the seam back to the boat also. It's not always at the bank, but that's probably the easiest way to explain the motion of what we're trying to do. If you've drug jigs, if you do a lot of dragging jigs, you know, and you've drug plastics or night crawlers, you're kind of mimicking the same type of presentation, but you're doing it by casting. But it's the same concept. Keep it just off the bottom, because that's generally where the fish are, is close to the bottom. I don't impede